Hi, I'm Dr. Hansa Bhargava, Senior Medical Director and Correspondent for Medscape and WebMD. And today I'm really excited to have two experts here with me to talk about mental health issues today. Dr. Mitrani, thank you so much for being here. Dr. Kamyar, thank you so much. Can you both tell me a little bit about yourself? We'll start with you, Paul.
So I'm the clinical director at the Child Mind Institute. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I'm also boarded in pediatrics. My interest is really in the mental health disorders and learning disorders that children are facing today, as well as kind of medical issues that they may be dealing with at the same time.
My name is Royan Kamyar. I'm actually a physician by training, but a full-time entrepreneur. So I'm working on a project called O-Waves. It's a digital therapeutic, which is kind of up-and-coming field within digital health, where software is actually being prescribed as a drug, as an intervention. And I also do some consulting for the Scripps Research Institute in San Diego, where I'm involved with the Precision Medicine Initiative, which is the NIH's attempt to really do our equivalent of the UK Biobank, and it's considered the longest and largest NIH clinical trial in history.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for being here today. So we're talking about an urgent issue today, which is really mental health. And we know we've heard a lot about that, both in academia, in the news, and today we're going to be talking about mental health in youth. And so I'll just get right to it. We know that mental health issues are on the rise. In fact, in young adults, recent studies have shown an increase in depression rates by 60% and suicide by 56% over the last few years. And also, according to this Child Mind Institute, 1/3 of kids will meet the criteria for anxiety disorder by age 18. So Dr. Mitrani, I will go to you first. With the background that you bring to the table, psychiatry, child psychiatry, what do you think is happening here? Is it that we're recognizing these disorders more, or are they truly on the rise?
So kids have been struggling for a long time with mental health disorders, and one of the issues is how well we're able to recognize it, right? Especially with things like anxiety and depression, because those are internalizing disorders, and we may not notice it until the symptoms really get kind of severe. So one of the things that we're seeing is that parents are more aware of it, physicians are more aware of it, so they need to be recognizing the signs more, and also because parents are aware of it, they're wanting to get their kids into treatment. So right now, in children, we're seeing about 20% of kids, or one in every 5 kids, has a mental health disorder, right? And then as far as who's actually getting treatment, that's another issue, because it's about 60% of kids with a depression will get treatment. 40% of kids with ADHD may get some treatment, and 20% of kids with anxiety may get a treatment. And that's because we need to recognize it and then actually get them to the provider that can help them. That's another issue as well, is just having enough providers to see all these kids.
Yeah, we will definitely get to that point as well. And Dr. Kamyar, if you don't mind me, I'll ask you by your first name.
Sure.
Royan,
Please.
You've done some research with Scripps and in your company about circadian rhythms. Do you think that there is any link between the circadian rhythm aspect and mental health issues?
Definitely. I think there's, in terms of what we're describing, it's most likely multifactorial. So it's not just one issue sort of causing, the increased rates of depression and suicide and anxiety that we're seeing. But if you talk to circadian biologists, they will say we have an epidemic of circadian rhythm disruptances. There's actually an epidemic of poor sleep health. If you can compare our current sleep habits with decades ago, especially pre-artificial light, we're literally losing, as a society, 1 solid hour of sleep per night on average. So that's clearly going to be an issue, and it's exacerbated by the technology which you're bringing up.
And so I'm a pediatrician by training, and one of the points that we make to parents is to turn off those screens 1 hour before.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that would go along with what you're saying as well.
Right. So we know that blue light from our screens, so whether it's an iPhone or a smartphone, tablet, computer, television, or incandescent light bulb, blue light can directly inhibit melatonin release, which is considered the sleep hormone, or at least begins the process of getting our body physiologically prepared for deep sleep. So there's a direct cause and effect issue going on. There are interventions being made by the manufacturers. They have some blue light protections or minimization techniques, some blue light blocking glasses, but these are still being tested and they're not foolproof. So this is an epidemic issue because we're all carrying one in our hands, and we know that socially we're pretty much jet lagged. as a society.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, and the way technology works is, again, you're always on, and kids have it all the time. Kids are using it as an alarm, even though they shouldn't. And I think one study showed that, the average amount of text that a child is sending after going to bed is like 34. And
That's
the fact that they're
incredible.
awake and they're scrolling and they're doing all these different things, they're not getting good sleep.
Yep.
And one of the things that kind of we need to know more about is, how much of it is the screens themselves or the devices that they're using? How much of it is a kid with depression who already has sleep problems and then is using their screen because they can't get to sleep, right? And that's exacerbating things.
Yeah.
Or how much of it is that, again, they're on the screen, they're not sleeping, and then that can lead to depression
Absolutely.
or anxiety.
And it's
like
hard
chicken and
to
egg.
pull that
Yeah.
It's
apart.
like a chicken and an egg and something else. It's like trying to figure it out is, can be really difficult, but that's where we need to really monitor and really figure out these things.
And part of the issue is also social media, right? Like it's the texting and the group texting and social media, and it seems like that's such a huge central part for kids and their lives these days.
Yeah.
So, Child Mind Institute is coming out with a report soon about social media, gaming, and mental health. And so would you be able to give us any, and I know the report's coming out, so you don't have to talk to the report necessarily, but in general, what influence does social media have on mental health for kids?
So it's definitely an influence, and it's one of those things where anytime a new technology comes out, we were talking about before, like radio or television, there's going to be pros and cons. So like there's the connectedness, right, or the sense of belonging that a kid can get from being on social media and finding a group where they feel like they belong. But at the same time, if they're scrolling through things and kind of just liking things and not interacting with people, we know that's going to negatively affect their mental health, right, their well-being. So we want to make sure that we're setting good limits and we're kind of seeing what they're doing and how they're using it, because that makes a big difference, right? The other thing is there's so many other things that are coming on that kids are going to struggle with. It's cyberbullying, and that could be 24/7.
Yeah.
So like if a kid is online and parents aren't aware of it, they could be getting bullied and exacerbating all those things that are going on. And unfortunately, the kids that are bullied in real life are the ones that are more vulnerable to the cyberbullying, right?
Yeah.
And if they don't have somebody to go to, then they're going to kind of be worse for wear.
Yeah, it's just a complicated issue now. I mean, there's just so many aspects of it. So, Royan, you were telling me outside that, interestingly, seasonal affective disorder has been linked to circadian rhythms, and recently there's a Nobel Prize that was in 2017 that kind of was the first part of the circadian rhythm research. Well, not the first part, but a significant part, let's say.
Right, gave credit to the science, essentially.
Yeah, so can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think, that's very interesting, and perhaps this is the way we're going to be going.
And there's definitely overlap. So when I went to medical school, so I graduated from Baylor College of Medicine in 2006, I think we literally got two days on the circadian rhythm, and it was all about sleep-wake cycle. And that was essentially, my understanding of circadian rhythms for quite a long time. Until serendipitously, while I was at business school at UC San Diego, I came across essentially a journal club, a circadian rhythm journal club. UC San Diego just happens to have one of the first dedicated centers for circadian biology. And so I became, as an aspiring entrepreneur, when I went to their MBA program in 2008, 2010, started looking for new ideas in terms of projects that I could resonate with. And I started discovering this entire category of science that I felt like I personally really hadn't learned. And frustratingly, I found out that the people who are most savvy to circadian rhythms and applying it into everyday life were elite athletes, Olympic athletes, professional athletes, Major League Baseball, NFL. And so I was honestly just upset. I was like, this is not fair. I just spent my whole life studying science, biology, biochemistry. And now, after medical school, after my medical intern year, I'm finding out about basically I feel like an underlying science for how to optimize health, how to optimize our physiology.
Doctors are the opposite of that, right? Especially in residency.
Exactly. And so that hypocrisy and that finding of like, oh my God, there's, this is at a genetic level that we have these 24-hour oscillations, these 24-hour patterns, which, have far beyond sleep-wake, have major implications for our health. First, I was frustrated. Then I saw the opportunity. And so I kind of plunged myself into that space. And so to your point, fortunately, I graduated 2010, started going to these meetings 2011, 2013. I mentioned to you, my dad's still a practicing gastroenterologist. And to him and a lot of people we were going to with our project, it was still considered kind of a woo-woo science, unfortunately. Only now sleep science as a whole is really getting its credit and the attention is being paid. But circadian rhythms was, still kind of suffering from, there's not enough evidence, not enough validation. When the Nobel Prize went out in the fall of 2017, everyone started paying attention, and now it's much easier for us as an entity to make relationships to start clinical trials. So it really validated
Very
the science,
interesting.
and it's kind of, in our mind, it's kind of, going to be recognized as a hallmark moment where
Yeah.
we mentioned that the NIH funding cycle, now that the credit has been given, by the time you apply, perform the research, and publish, it's at least 5 years
It
from that
is.
2017 benchmark.
Right.
So hopefully by 2023, you can quote me on this now,
Sure.
we'll start seeing a wave of
Sure.
clinical applications of this basic science has been sitting on the shelf for decades.
Yeah. So Paul, in your practice, you could be telling people just go to sleep and everything will be better, right?
Yes. Well, that's one of the issues. I mean, sleep disturbances are like a symptom of so many mental health disorders.
Yeah.
There's trouble falling asleep because you're anxiety, because you're depressed, because you have ADHD, even kind of in adults more. Like, you're having psychotic symptoms at night or you're manic. So these are all things that affect sleep, and we know that anytime you're not getting enough sleep, your body's going to be unable to function at its optimal level when you're awake. So that's going to affect your performance. It's going to affect your concentration. It's going to exacerbate a lot of the symptoms from those disorders, and it's something that we really need to get a good sense of how we can control.
I just want to pick up on
Yeah.
this important point of sleep and how it relates to mental health.
Yeah.
It's actually becoming more recognized in the American College Health Association. So our project is mostly focusing on college students and trying to manage
Yeah. And we have
their
a
lifestyle.
survey actually that we were going to talk about. So go ahead.
Right, and
Yeah.
so what they're finding is sleep is actually an optimal wedge issue to communicate to their students around mental health, because you're not going to get football jocks or the classic
Yeah.
college student to kind of be comfortable about saying, oh, I have depression or I'm feeling suicidal. That conversation starter is really
Yeah.
hard. But talking about sleep, are you getting enough sleep, and how's your sleep health and the physiological benefits, the performance benefits of sleep, for example, or concentration, grade benefits of sleep,
Yeah.
that becomes a topic that allows the health counselors on campuses to open the door eventually to more serious mental health conversations as needed.
Yeah.
That's great, actually.
And it's important because
yeah.
you're just exploring what the issues may be. It's like I can't fall asleep, I can't stay asleep, I'm waking
Yeah.
up too early and I can't go back to sleep. Like all those things, there's reasons for. And
Yeah.
if you can understand those reasons, then you have a way to intervene potentially.
So it's a great conversation starter for the athletes in college, but interestingly, the same college actually did a survey, and they found that over 50% of college students at some point, have overwhelming anxiety.
Right.
And to your point of mental health access, that's a huge issue with college as well,
Yes.
and we know suicide rates are also going up. So, Paul, what do you think might be the driver in that circumstance? Is it, again, more recognition, or is there actually increased pressure? Or is social media contributing to that? Is it a number of things?
Well, it's always a number of things. But we know that there is more pressure in general, and the fact that anxiety is one of the most prevalent disorders there is, like add that to the pressure and you're going to have more of these symptoms. And we know it's difficult for a lot of kids, that adjustment to college and kind of the expectations they have for it. But also when going back to like social media and the things that we're seeing online, everybody's aware of what everybody's doing now, so it's like, I went out with my friends, I got a good grade on this test, and when people, even though people know there's a lot of like highlight reel effect or kind of the whitewashing of things that people post, they know that, but they're still affected by it.
Absolutely.
So one of the issues is they're going away to college, and if they have that vulnerability with anxiety and then they have the pressure of all these things coming together, they're going to experience more anxiety, and then the resources aren't there, like the college campuses and the counselors, there's not enough of them to go around to really help these kids the way they need to. So a lot of it is, if we can prepare them for college before they go away, so that maybe they can address it better on their own.
What about the issue of overscheduling? Is that an issue? Do you think that that's an issue that happens earlier than college and it becomes like a continuation of the problem? Or do you think that higher academic pressures and college pressures, as parents often allude to, could be a contributing factor? I mean, this is kind of getting off the expertise of psychiatry or innovations or anything, but really a general question that we all combat as physicians and parents and uncles.
We do see it a lot,
Right.
and it is a very legitimate question. It's something that we need to ask ourselves, especially as parents, right? Like if your child is scheduled so much that they don't have enough time to get enough sleep that they need, or they can't get their work done, or they can't spend time with their friends or family because they're doing all these other things, then they're probably overscheduled, and that's where you have to have that conversation of what can we cut back on, like what are the most important things, because we want kids to have a life that they can enjoy. We don't want them to feel this constant pressure. And then we're setting a good example, and it's something we could, as parents and physicians, we can role model for them as well. Like we need to have those breaks scheduled in and that unstructured time where they can just be kids.
Right.
So I have to comment on the scheduling question because that's basically what the Always project is dedicated for, right? It's
Yeah.
essentially a calendaring app that's meant
Yeah.
to help optimize
Yeah.
our lifestyle. Almost totally based on Dean Ornish's work, around the Foundation for the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, for example, and the decades of work he did to essentially show that lifestyle can benefit, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, the list goes on. But essentially, there's 5 main components. There's sleep, as we've been talking about. Nutrition, obviously you have to eat to live a long, healthy life. Exercise, physical activity. Relationships, so it's kind of sad that we need science to point this out, but love and relationships are probably one of probably the driving factor for longevity and well-being. And finally, stress management. So we know heart disease is still the #1 killer, and major cause of heart disease is stress. And so these kind of 5 foundations. What we find interesting, we call them the lifestyle vital signs. They share a common denominator of time, hours and minutes, and actually 4 of the 5 are currently prescribed in units of time. And time, hours and minutes, is a metric that even a child can wrap their mind around, right? So we're not going into steps or beats per minute or respiratory rate or millimeters of mercury, right? We're talking about hours and minutes, and that's something that you can actually manage and hopefully control to a certain degree. So in terms of overscheduling, Paul, you mentioned like schedule that free time or schedule that relaxation time. So, in our concept, we're trying to convert sort of the traditional calendars where it's almost all schoolwork and errands into a more holistic experience where you're actually visualizing 8 hours of sleep, visualizing a meal plan, anticipating an exercise or physical activity. So I think you can kind of reframe the problem around the schedule and actually leverage the calendar as a behavior change tool for the best.
And that's the biggest thing too, right? Finding that balance. Right, and we talk about that too with like screen time. So there's like the Goldilocks hypothesis where like none is not good. There's a certain amount that is good for kids, and then there's a certain amount that's bad for kids. But not having any is also maybe not the best thing. And we try to find that balance, and that's where the discussion and kind of as parents and clinicians, we try to see what's best for those kids. But when things are out of balance, we know things get worse.
And just going on one of those pillars that you mentioned, Roy, and it's interesting, you mentioned relationships. So relationships as friends, family, acquaintances, the sphere gets bigger as you kind of move away from the core of that unit. So some parents may argue, or some people may argue that, well, Facebook is relationships, or Twitter is relationships, or Instagram's relationships. So all these social media platforms, I have so many followers, of course I have relationships. How do you feel about that?
Well, some of the research that has been done has shown that the kids that are more social in real life are usually more social online as well, right? But they have that balance that we're talking about, so they can do better. It's the kids that are less social in real life and kind of retreat to online, or virtual friendships that are maybe not doing as much. And even the way they interact with people online is different from those more social kids. Right? And we know the kids that are more social in real life and have more in-person interactions, they tend to be happier. And that goes back to the question of potential rises in depression and anxiety and all these other mental health disorders that kids are struggling with. So we want to see what kids are doing. That's why it's really important not just to know how much time they're spending online, but actually what they're spending that time doing.
Ryan, what are your thoughts on this?
I thought that was well put. And I think the jury's still out. I mean, we're getting to a point where we have to study this now. Like, how much face-to-face time are you having per day? Right? Like, that's a metric that we actually have to start caring about. And determining, what's going to happen if, the statistic from, Wall Street Journal cited, I think from Pew in 2011, which is the last time I checked on this, was an average of 8 hours of screen time per day, right? So if we're sleeping approximately 8, that means half of our waking lives are spent staring at a screen.
That's actually really,
and it's probably gone up,
correct,
right? I mean, I know as a lot of my job as a technology entrepreneur is spent behind a computer screen, and those are the worst days when I have 12-hour sprints where it's like me and the computer. And no, to answer your question, those tweets and Facebook messages I get don't feel like they're sufficing for a relationship. I crave even going to a Starbucks and talking to the barista is like, oh my God, like I am a human.
Yeah.
So
And that goes back to the potential avoidance or escape from social interactions for kids that are anxious, right? It's easier to have an online relationship than it is to kind of have a face-to-face interaction, because that requires more emotional and cognitive effort, right? And that can be exhausting, especially if you have anxiety. So it's easier to communicate through the phone, or online to kind of have those interactions. They can be reassuring, and there's a lot of kids who have the benefit of kind of creating those relationships, and the goal is then to kind of get them to go into real life, right? Like to help facilitate these things as opposed to staying in that virtual realm.
I agree.
And the question also becomes like that small study that was done, and it was very small in middle schoolers, where they actually noticed that kids can't recognize facial expressions, right? And so what impact will it have on communication styles? Because a communication specialist will tell you that most of the communication is nonverbal. I can, I look at you both and I can tell you're interested in this conversation. Hopefully you are. But
No, it is a big shift, and it's the same thing with education, right? There's been so much of a push towards academics, so starting earlier, preschool, kindergarten, there's more academics. It used to be about playing and interacting with kids and building those social skills. And there has been a shift in multiple realms towards less social interactions, and we're not learning those skills as much, Kids don't go to school to learn how to make friends. Like, they're going to school to learn ABCs, and their math, but that's a skill that they need. And it's going back to the thing about, emotional intelligence. We really need to help kids understand their own feelings and have that self-awareness and be able to self-regulate and interact with other kids. And if they don't learn that, then they're going to be at a worse place when they kind of have to do those things.
And I think our society was built on organically giving those kids the skills. And now all of a sudden, to your point about the time, like that time has been lost to other things. So, where are they going to get the skills from?
It's the same thing we were saying before with the pressure. Right? Like, I need to have my kid doing a violin and, acting and doing math club, and that's going to help them get into a good college. And, we need to prioritize things better.
Yes.
Because otherwise our kids are going to suffer, and they're going to suffer silently. And then, we're going to have these outcomes that we don't like.
And everyone only has 24 hours.
Yes.
That is not changeable.
The balance and the free time, I mean, that needs to be scheduled in.
Yep. Absolutely. I do think that, and from a pediatric perspective, we talk about that a lot, about how things have the basic things that kids need, the playtime, the creative time, and actually the relationships, the buffering that actually guards against mental health. It's being lost
It's really
in a lot
important,
of families.
and those things also help reinforce all those other things.
Yeah.
Right. So the things that you're learning, you're interacting with your friends, and you're talking about things that happen in school or whatever, and then you're able to kind of communicate in a better way. And that's what we want kids to do too. We want them to be able to communicate with us about what they're thinking and feeling.
And I think you mentioned this really quickly, but I think it's such a huge point is that we really need to get to a point with our relationship, and ultimately, we're speaking mostly to physicians, the design and development of these technologies to enhance relationships. And we have to be really consciously creating these technologies to augment. Oh, so my wife is going to be in traffic at this time, and there's actually a common window between 5 to 6 p.m. where we can actually meet for lunch or dinner, and a convenient intersection. AI should help us do that, right?
I like that idea. That's a great idea.
I mean, versus, if you talk or read, about the Silicon Valley technologists are thinking, and, they deliberately, creating technologies to make us addicted to their platforms, right? To distract
Persuasive
us,
technology,
ultimately.
right.
And so there has to be some leadership from clinicians,
Agreed.
the mindfulness community, and it's starting to happen. Wisdom 2.0 has a conference that's both in New York and San Francisco, and there's a Center for Humane Technology, which was started by Tristan Harris, who came out of Google as a design ethicist from their team. Ariana Huffington is doing a lot of work, and she helped move Samsung, and eventually Apple caught up with screen time metrics. But frankly, especially as it relates to the theme of intervening, preventing, managing, treating mental health, clinicians have to be playing a role. They have to be at the table. And it's not enough to do research on the aftermath of, well, now that Facebook's out and there's billions of people hooked on it, what's happening? That's not enough from the physician community.
Exactly.
The next
train's
Facebook
already left the
has to
station.
have a physician or clinician at the round table. There has to be that level of diligence. And I think the birth is starting to happen, but as a communication, in terms of, what we're trying to express, and I think where the direction needs to go is, we know software is eating the world, right?
Yep.
I mean, that's basically, and the next generation is really AI. And so, we need clinicians to really play a role in terms of where the attention goes when we stare at our device.
I couldn't agree with you more, Ryan, and I don't know how you feel, Paul, but I do agree with you. We need to be at the table. We need to be part of the conversation because it's going to happen, and the guidance is needed in all of these spheres, including technology, which I'm going to turn to for a few minutes now, because as you alluded to before, Paul, mental health access is a challenge. And in fact, in this country, when I looked last, less than 3 of the states in the entire nation are actually even meeting 50% of the mental health needs. And the rural areas are far worse. So can we use technology? We talked about a little bit about the negative aspects of technology. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the other side, because everything can be a double-edged sword. And, when cars were invented, I'm sure people said they were terrible, right? And televisions, I know they did. So, but what are the benefits? And can we use technology to kind of fill some of those gaps? And, Ryan, what are your thoughts on that? And I'd love to hear your opinion too, Paul.
Sure. So I thought you were going to ask Paul first, and I had to. I thought I had time to think about it.
Well, yeah. I mean, so the access issue is always a problem, right? Like, I think right now there's between 8,000 and 9,000 child psychiatrists or mental health professionals that can help kids, and we need almost double that. Right, and so telemedicine or telehealth is one avenue to kind of address that need, but it still doesn't address the problem that there aren't enough of us to go around, right? And that there's more kids that need to be seen. It's about I think 17 million kids in the United States who have a mental health disorder and need help, right? So there's just not enough of us to go around. But then the innovations.
Is that 50% that aren't getting the help right now?
It's about that, yeah. So across all the different disorders,
Wow.
The other part is kind of what we can do with digital innovations or digital therapeutics, and that's where the app development comes in, or the online modalities that can potentially help people. And they're all the ones that are kind of more effective or kind of more evidence-based are good because they're using established interventions. And a big one is cognitive behavior therapy. And that's something that can help a lot of disorders, and it's first line for a lot of disorders. But we need to see how much it's changing when we implement it in a digital fashion, right? And that's something where we need to empirically test it. We need clinicians at the table to talk to the developers that are creating these things, because otherwise we're just selling a product and there's no evidence that it's actually going to help people.
Right.
And that's something, there's a lot of recommendations as far as we need to be upfront with what this is supposed to help with and what outcomes you can expect, as opposed to kind of selling it as, oh, this is going to cure everything. The other thing is whether it's supported through clinicians and there's somebody else, a real person to talk to or connect to, or unsupported where it's artificial intelligence. And those things, a lot of the criticisms are that it's like a self-help book, right? It's just a digital way to kind of do this, and they're just selling a product. But that's why we need to study what's the best way to implement it and what the mechanisms of change potentially are.
Ryan, can you comment on the studies or any of that?
Of course. I think this is the hot topic, right? Is how technology sort of evolves and kind of pivots from being sort of the culprit to part of the solution. And we're really just, we're in the first or second inning, of this. And that's the exciting part, and that's where we're trying to play a role. Dr. Topol's team at Scripps is doing a lot of work in digital medicine. You've been involved in some of those projects, and so we're really at the early stages. I think some of this is, frankly, a little bit no-brainer, right? I mean, if you can't have someone physically access, a four-walled clinical location, but you can provide talk therapy remotely by your phone, which this person's carrying with them, and they're already depressed and don't want to leave the room anyways. Let it happen, make it happen, whatever regulatory, medical, legal, reimbursement issues, let's figure it out. And again, this is where, all these concerns about privacy, security, they're legitimate. But there's also a harm in letting these people continue to suffer. You mentioned the American College of Health Association statistics, over 50%. Over 1 out of every 2 college students reporting symptoms of depression or anxiety.
It's very concerning.
33% of college freshmen drop out. The number one reason is mental health. 1/3 of college freshmen drop out, and the number one provided reason is mental health. And at the same time, 2016 survey, only 5% of universities nationwide are offering telepsychology or telecounseling services for students. That's a red flag. That means that we're not trying, we're not paying attention. The people are trying. So I mentioned I go to these academic American College Health Association conferences, but it's the efforts are almost bootstrapped. They're using tools like Zoom. They're using Google Hangouts. They're trying to get there, but right now at least the momentum's not strong enough. There's some solutions that are playing kind of niche or kind of siloed roles, but there's just so much more to be done, especially when you hear that type of statistic.
Yep.
It just lets you know that there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, no, I think the college issue is a real concern, and so is the mental health issue in kids. We do need to wrap up soon, so I do have one other question. Since you both brought it up, we can use technology to close some of these gaps, and especially in mental health, which is an urgent issue right now. But how do you get physician buy-in? I'm going to ask you, Paul, first.
To use these modalities or kind of consider them, it's really hard, especially even in the mental health field. Like there are clinicians who are hesitant to kind of engage in that type of care, right? Like we're very used and comfortable with having them in our office and talking with them and having that face-to-face interaction. So part of getting the buy-in is getting them comfortable with that and potentially using it as part of training. Right? That, all right, you're going to see some patients via telehealth or something like that. The other thing is, again, having the evidence base to say that these things work. Right. I mean, there's lots of advantages. It's scalable, it's more cost effective, the access and the autonomy or the confidentiality that people feel like not being in somebody's office versus kind of like being at home. All those things are really great. But we need to make sure it works. Right?
So do you think that AI could replace doctors?
I do not.
I asked that facetiously.
It's definitely a tool that can help us, right? And that's the thing. We need all the help we can get. So we want to make sure that these things are happening. And we can say like, all right, we're going to see each other weekly, or we can go to every other week, but I want you to use this when you're out of here. And that's the thing. Like we can send notifications, we can check in with them. There's a lot of
augmentation
and even just like symptom tracking, right? So that when you come back and see your clinician, you're able to talk about, oh, well, I see on Sunday you had a really rough day. What was going on then? And then you can process
really
that
useful,
and use it.
You get lines of data instead of dots.
Yeah, well, also, patients may not remember a week ago how they were feeling. So if you could actually track those symptoms, that would be very helpful.
And a lot of the care we're already providing tries to utilize that, like having a diary card for different types of modalities, like dialectical behavior therapy. But it's hard for people to carry on a piece of paper and remember that. But they always have their phone. So if we can make it digitized and we make it easier for them, or we send them notifications, then we get more information and we can help them more.
Yeah, it's meeting the patient where they are, basically, right? Rather than expecting them to follow you, you kind of follow them. Ryan, your thoughts?
On clinicians' buy-ins, or just a kind of general summary?
However you want to take it, but I would like to know what you think about clinicians' buy-in.
Yeah, I think I think what will really help is if clinicians get more involved, frankly, because this is the next generation of therapeutics, of drugs. Companies like Novartis, companies like Johnson & Johnson, they're setting up teams to essentially, again, market software as a drug. And so if clinicians aren't the ones conceiving of these ideas, performing the research, then they're going to be, essentially marketed to. There's going to be, sales reps coming into physician offices saying, "Hey, this app works for, substance abuse. This app works for, schizophrenia," and those conversations are already starting to happen. Thankfully, a lot of clinicians are leading those companies, but essentially, I think that is the type of interdisciplinary, team spirit essentially that has to be behind these technologies. Otherwise, if there's an antagonistic relationship between the generation and implementation or utilization of these treatments, then it's just going to be much more difficult, much more long-term. And then we have these access issues, perpetuating, and we just don't end up taking control of these devices, right? And so I think, again, physicians have to play a role. They have to play a leading role at all ends of the spectrum, not just the downstream saying, oh, now that Facebook is out, what are the effects? No. We have to be like the next Facebook. This is this type of stuff. This is the type of thinking that needs to go into the DNA of the technology.
It needs to be a partnership. Like it's the only way we're going to make progress.
Great. Well, on that positive note, we all want you doctors to come into this conversation. And actually, to be honest with you, Roy, as you were talking about that, and Paul, you were talking about that, it reminded me of another technological intervention that happened years ago where we weren't at the table, or only some of us were, and that was the electronic medical record. So I think that I 100% agree with both of you. I just want to thank you both for being here today. It was a great discussion, and hopefully we can have more of these.
Nice.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.